In this film, volunteers of aging parents relate to their experiences and pass on their advice about how to cope with issues like declining health, loss of mobility, and dementia in their loved ones. This story is genuine and heartfelt. We are aware that there are many more aspects of care that have not been covered in this interview, some often traumatic. What you will find here is wisdom and insights, as well as some humour and lighter moments. We are very grateful to those who took part for being willing to talk about this difficult issue. Did your parents talk about their wishes for the future when they were still able to?
I started to ask my parents about wills and talking about their background many years before my mother had or was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She wrote a long letter to me saying she did not want to be resuscitated. Mm-hmm. That was as close as I got before her dementia was diagnosed to identifying what her wishes might be and how we should proceed in the event of loss of mental capacity.
When did you first notice that your mother was declining?
It's actually, you need a diary of things that don't appear correct or things that are not normal for that person, like putting things in the cupboard in the wrong way, or putting sugar in the fridge and the milk in the cupboard.
So did you notice that?
Started to notice that, but not so much, because to notice those things, you need to be around that person and that person's home on a regular basis. It's probably the cleaner, actually, who would notice more of those things than the actual family, which is an interesting dynamic. I noticed it when my mother started to come to see us and look after the kids, to bond with them, and having been visiting us for 6-7 years in that same house, suddenly she started to get lost. She would get on the wrong bus, go in the wrong direction, where to get a call, slightly frustrated or slightly anxious, saying, I've got on a bus, I must have made a mistake. Lots and lots and lots of different excuses. And that's a very interesting part. The other start was when she started talking to my niece, who was only 6 at the time, about her various love affairs throughout her life, which was sweet in one respect, but totally inappropriate in another. She used to be a very outward-going person, and with lots of activities and lots of friends, and that started to narrow. She was frightened of going out, she was frightened of getting lost, she was frightened of not being able to know who the person was that she had known for 10 years but couldn't remember their name. So there's a tremendous amount of fear evolving through this early stages of a dementia.
And when you saw all of this, what was your reaction?
It's a question of shoot the messenger. Nobody wants to hear that a family member is coming down with such a horrendous disease. So when I went to speak to my father about it, and I said, Dad, we have a problem. Mum is not behaving in a normal way, and I think there's something that needs to be done, or someone needs to have words with her. My father said, no, I spoke to her yesterday. She seems fine. In fact, it took me nearly 2 years to convince the family that something was wrong.
So what was your reaction? Obviously you noticed.
I was trying to support a family and run a business. Noticing these things that were happening was more of a problem for me in relation to my mother's relationship with my children, and the fact that she was no longer coming to the home anymore because of various spurious reasons that she'd created to actually to cover up the real anxiety was that she was going to get lost or that she couldn't remember. I mean, she came up with some strange things about the way my wife cooked the food and said, I don't like your food. Well, she'd been eating that food for the last 10 years. There were many little scenarios which in themselves weren't a problem, but ultimately adding them all up together, which is why I mentioned you need the diary to just notate these things. Adding them up together indicates is a way of indicating the condition.
So when did you decide that you had to get involved?
When it was decided that it was a family, that there was a problem, that we went to the GP, whereas we should have actually been diagnosed way in advance, we weren't. Partly because of my mother's denial and the family's denial, and also the inability of the GP to act and to refer her to the memory clinic, etc.
So what practical steps did you start to take? Financial, legal, domestic?
Well, the first was that she was in a flat 4 floors up with no lift. So her bag became extremely heavy. So this bag got bigger and bigger and bigger, became extremely heavy as a result of putting notes upon notes upon notes about more notes, and notes about the notes you'd made notes of. I noticed that she was moving up the stairs more tentatively, and as a result of that, we had to make a decision as to whether or not she was able to remain in that property and become a prisoner because there was no lift and it was a rented facility, or alternatively move her into her boyfriend's house, which is where we are at the moment.
So were you providing the care, or were there carers coming in?
There were no carers at that time. She didn't need the care. What she needed was to acknowledge the fact she had a problem and allow people then to help her, because that's another aspect. People are in denial at this point. The family's in denial, the elderly person is in denial, and it's a problem all round. I think denial actually is one of the biggest barriers to resolving and supporting people in this particular illness.
Did things change over time? Did she go downhill?
When one started to realise what the symptoms were, and the way that the illness was impacting upon her, she'd used to say, "Look, I'm perfectly fine. I can stand on one leg holding the kitchen sink." Silly little things. Accusing my wife of stealing her knickers. All sorts of odd little examples. So it wasn't one symptom, and as a result of that, it wasn't one action.
Did you look after her yourselves, or did you have carers coming in too?
I was employed at IBM at the time, and I gave up IBM full-time employment to become a family carer. And as I pointed out to the Alzheimer's Society, I knew more about my wine and my whiskey than I did about my mother's condition. There was no training for family carers at that point. There was nothing. It was all aimed at the professions, and all very blue sky. There was nothing pragmatic. There was no advice on how to deal with wandering or aggressive behaviour. I mean, these were put into very politically correct references of challenging behaviours, but challenged behaviours. Give me something practical to do. How do I stop my mum from going out the door at 4 o'clock in the morning because she thinks she's got to go and pick the kids up? Because she got day and night reversed, and at that 4 o'clock would have been 4 in the afternoon when she goes and picks the kids up. How do you stop that? Well, you don't, basically. But that's another story.
So what was the hardest part for you when this sort of thing was happening?
The fact that I'd lost my mother and the ability to understand some of the background of the family, because she was the matriarch and she had that knowledge, and it was very sad. That's one of the things that I really regret, is not having a clearer understanding of my heritage, of my core, if you like, through my family. We have a very large family, and yet I feel very isolated because I don't know who they are.
On the practical level, if she was getting up at 4 and wandering, how did you feel about that?
Well, it was a nightmare. It's a nightmare when you're dealing with these challenging behaviours if you don't know how to deal with them. And also the natural process is that you restrict and you stop somebody from doing something that could potentially damage them or be harmful to them. I mean, that's essentially what mental capacity is. Do you have the mental capacity to be able to understand that going out at 4 a.m. is potentially dangerous, especially if you're not dressed appropriately? So, yeah, I think one of the things that you do, and it's a mantra, is don't create the barrier, go with the flow. If you try and reorientate that person, then you'll end up getting a tremendous amount of conflict. As a family member, if you try to say to someone who you are close to, don't do this, it would be a red rag to a bull. So in dealing with that, maybe when you get out the door, suggesting, let's go and have a cup of tea. It's a bit cold out, isn't it? So you diversify, you divert the person's attention from the key focus, or their focus, to something else. And more often than not, human common sense will prevail, ultimately. But if they don't, then you get the coat on and you go. Because that's the only way to deal with it. Otherwise, you are going to end up with a seriously challenging behaviour.
So you understood that over time, but some of your other family members disagreed or didn't get it.
The family won't see this dynamic going on. I mean, I think there needs to be a lot more research done, a lot more support on how do you deal with this family dynamic. I can tell you many different confrontations that I've had with the family. My brother, for example, wanted to put my mother into a nursing home. I felt that we could provide my mother with a better quality of life living in her own home and her own environment, supported by good quality carers on a one-to-one basis. In fact, actually, at times, she would, because I created little family units here, we had 4 carers, all living in, using the property to offset the cost of care. But she had a fantastic level of stimulation because there was always people around her, and that was one of the things she enjoyed.
So she enjoyed having carers around?
Oh, yeah.
Did she know they were carers?
I think at the early stages she knew they were carers. The latter stages she thought one of the carers was her husband, which was interesting. She was very flirtatious, my mother, so she enjoyed male carers, but we had both male and female carers. Yeah, I think that's the beauty of looking after someone in their own home, much more relaxed. They have their own routines, they have their own environment they're familiar with, so you don't get the same sort of aggression, frustration and insecurities that you would do within an institutional care environment.
Did you get any support for yourself?
No.
So for how long did your mother need support?
My mother remained in this house for nearly 10 years, which is quite something with a person with a dementia. I feel that is completely down to the fact that there was 24/7 company, companionship, support, stimulation, good food, good water, hydration practices, and that she was taken out and the family were familiar with the education of supporting a person with a dementia, so they wouldn't end up antagonizing her. So her real last 10 years were very supported, with regular visits from the family, both from my brother and sister and their siblings.
So you learnt to cope over time?
If it wasn't for the training that I had from the Alzheimer's Society in terms of their professional training, which I was then able to adapt for my family and for other family carers, I think I would have been quite lost. There's one example where I didn't realise the importance of my mother's nails until I went and searched back or thought about it a little bit more. My mother had very, very strong nails, fingernails, and it got to a point where she was scratching her skin, where we had to put gloves on her to stop her. And I said, we need to cut her nails. And she was a very feisty woman, very independent woman. So her nails for her were a symbol of her identity, her independence, and her ability to protect herself in the event of an attack. There was 4 people in. There was the carer, there was me, there was the chiropodist, and her husband. It was a nightmare. It was one of the most upsetting things that I can possibly imagine, because I just didn't understand what was going on behind, or for her, in her state of mind at that point, in relation to these fingernails. I was disarming her. So it's very important that you understand the motives, or one understands the motives. That's why a life history is a really important aspect of looking after an elderly person, anyone, because you get to know them. But more importantly, with a dementia, you have to know the background, because a lot of the behaviours that transpire when that illness takes hold, or the various different stages, will come from past experiences. Holocaust survivors, someone who's had a car accident or a trauma of some sort, or been abused. All of those things will come to the fore, not all the time, but they will come to the fore or create the personality that exists at the time for that person with that dementia who's lost in that background.
So she was here for 10 years. What was the impact on your family life?
I think I was blessed with very supportive brothers and sisters. If it hadn't been for my brother, I think I would have been very lost and overwhelmed. He dealt with all the admin, the enduring power of attorney, getting the mortgages sorted, etc., etc. Whilst I was dealing with more the pragmatic side of the care. So I would organise the carers, I would arrange for the hospital visits. So I was doing sort of the day-to-day practical stuff. He was doing the more sort of administrative, financing, legal side of things, and it worked very well. Had I not had that resource, I would have been struggling. It's too much for one person. And how people today manage that in the even more convoluted and complex setup within austerity as well, so nothing's handed to you, you have to fight for it. I don't know how elderly people manage.
And does all of this make you think of your own health and mortality?
I think a lot about my own health and mortality as a result of this, having been exposed to people with this illness. I have insisted, and we are downsizing at the moment. My wife has difficult knees, so everything is going to be level. All the doorways are appropriate for wheelchair access. When I was first here looking after my mother, she was with her husband, this lover of hers that she'd known for several years, 30 years to be precise. But within 3 months of her moving in to essentially this house, which wasn't renovated in any way, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So not only was I looking after my mother with Alzheimer's on my own, but then I was suddenly confronted with somebody with a terminal illness in a house that was totally inappropriate for supporting someone in a wheelchair who was going to die. And it was a total nightmare from that point of view. I was on my knees. I was working. I had to look after both of them at the same time when he came back from hospital, because the hospital couldn't do anything with it. The cancer had progressed so far. He was sent home to die. I was on my knees for 78 hours without any help whatsoever. That's not uncommon. And I think that the austerity measures that we're experiencing at the moment and the diversity in the way we live in terms of living away from parents and the loss of community is creating a tremendous strain on our society, because with family and family carers like myself at that time have got nowhere to turn to. And it's very hard, very, very hard.
Did you face any ethical dilemmas, such as quality of life, end of life?
My mother was a very attractive, coquettish and flirtatious woman. So I do not think that she would have wanted to live, knowingly, to live the way the condition that she had, a dementia, was forcing her to live. And I think that if we could have ended it sooner on the basis that this was her wish, as she wrote down in her numerous letters of this is how I want to be, to be treated in my old age, she would not wanted to have gone that whole length. It was a very difficult battle between keeping her at home on the basis that it was more complex than putting into an institution, which my brother wanted to do. But my brother was very supportive and agreed that this was a better course of action. When it came to end of life, we knew that she wouldn't have wanted to be sustained or resuscitated, and she ended up having a chest infection, which is sometimes called the doctor's helper, on the basis that 1 in 5 people die of pneumonia, which is a chest infection essentially. So we agreed as a family, on the basis that was her wish, to let her pass away naturally, and she did so. I think that there needs to be more discussion about the ethics of supporting somebody who doesn't have capacity, not within a professional institutional environment, but actually within the home, to ensure that at least there is some degree of maintaining that person's wishes, both from a financial, social and spiritual way.
How long ago did your mother die?
My mother passed away 3 years ago, and she was in hospital because she had a chest infection, and we all decided with the hospital's agreement that we'd let her go slowly, etc. My wife was invited to India to do a series of lectures, and we were leaving the next day. So we went into the hospital, we said our goodbyes, the family were there. It's very touching, very moving. I have a photograph. And we arrived in India, and as I arrived, my mobile phone kicked in, and there was a text saying Mum had passed away. When I lost my mum, I still feel the grief. Yeah, she was rather something special.
So based on what you've learned, would you do anything differently if you had to do it all again?
If I had the chance to roll back time, I would say I would spend more time gathering family history so that it would have a legacy for myself and my children, who were very close to her but have been denied that opportunity to understand their roots and their origins and who my mother was. We have photographs, not many, but we do have photographs. I think for a lot of that generation, talking about the past is quite painful, especially if they come from a minority such as the Jewish faith, religious or not religious. I think that that generation, having gone through the war years, seen horrendous things, don't want to talk about stuff. But actually, it's denying the next generation and future generations an understanding of where they come from, because I don't think that you can escape one's upbringing. You can't escape some of those issues and the emotional responses that time has forged in our parents and their circumstances. Their emotional responses to those circumstances are to some degree passed on. There is a pattern. They're to some degree passed on. So understanding our own patterns and our own origins will help us to understand ourselves better. And in the future, in the event of a dementia, heaven forbid, but in the event of such a occurrence, then one has at least the understanding of one's behaviours to understand how to respond to those behaviours when you are in this illness. But to understand one's roots is psychologically very fulfilling and very empowering. So if I had to roll back time, I would spend more time, more effort in understanding her past and the family's past than I do at the moment.
In the case of the care of dementia, what advice would you give to someone going through that?
Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. You can't support somebody with a dementia unless you have all your ducks in a row. It will be unbelievably more stressful. The family got to be on board. You've got to engage with the community, both from a medical, social health perspective, as well as avoiding social isolation. To not think of what's happening today, but think of what's happening tomorrow. You can so easily tell the way people are thinking, and to some degree their denial, when they say, "Oh, well, things are all right now," or they're we don't have too many problems, or "I'm coping. All I need is a cleaner, to help out. I'm finding a bit tired." They are in denial, because what they're not doing is addressing what they will need tomorrow, not what they need now. They're dealing with what they need now. They've dealt with, that's a done deal. What they're not preparing for is the next stage, when those things start to get worse, such as incontinence, such as mobility issues, such as getting lost, or the challenging behaviours that are common within the earliest stages of the dementia. So if I'm going to offer advice to any individual that is facing this scenario, is seek help, get your infrastructure in place. Don't think about the situation now, but think about it in how it will be in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, and get the support of people behind you to start to put the infrastructure in place to deal with it. Don't leave it to the last minute.
And were there any lighter moments?
Yeah, you have to have your light moments to sort of, make it all worthwhile and move it forward. I took my mum on holiday. During the early stages, it is possible to do that. They do have cognitive ability and skills that remain. So as long as they feel secure, that's the key to it. As long as they feel secure, and that there is a system whereby they're not going to get anxious because they know how to get hold of you in the event that they want to, albeit they might want to do it 1 minute and then forget and then contact you again 5 minutes later, and the same thing will repeat and repeat and repeat. That's not the point. The point is they feel relatively secure to remain on their own. So you can take an elderly person with a dementia in the early stages away on holiday, and that was great. So we had a lovely time in Greece. We had a lovely time in Turkey. Those were very precious times. But nonetheless, it was still very frustrating that I lost all that past history. You know, she went to Canada during the war years, lost all of that. Having said that, she started at one stage in the condition, she started to speak French, because obviously French Canada. So my wife, who speaks perfect French, basically they would engage in a conversation in French. I can't speak French, so I was cut out of the whole loop, but nonetheless it was really interesting and lovely to hear my mother speaking very, very fluent Quebec French, which my wife was struggling with, but nonetheless they managed to communicate in French in some shape. That was lovely. There were moments of magic, and she was very affectionate. There's a phase called a inhibition phase, where someone might sort of take their clothes off, or be a little bit more flamboyant. For my daughter's celebration, her 13th birthday, we had a big party, and she danced the socks off me. I mean, she really did dance. I mean, I thought that she was going to have a heart attack. I was having a heart attack. I was exhausted, but she was all for it. I mean, talk about Cinderella. Fantastic.